Hi everybody, welcome back. Glad you could tune in again. So in the previous devotion in this series, we began to talk about marriage, and in particular we looked at Genesis chapter 2. We saw that what we now call marriage and what was described by Jesus as marriage in the first century, and indeed marriage as a structure for human life, corresponds to the pattern in Genesis 2 whereby the Lord instituted a relationship between Adam, the first man, and Eve, the first woman, whereby he says in Genesis 2, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And that union, that bond, that relationship of marriage is modelled on and patterned on the covenantal bond between God and his people. The same verb is used to describe the cleaving of a man to his wife as is used elsewhere to describe the cleaving between God and his people. And that accounts for a couple of things. Firstly, it accounts for the widespread use of the idea of adultery, that is unfaithfulness within marriage, as a picture of spiritual idolatry, the of forsaking of the true God to follow other gods. You find that in the prophets, particularly Hosea and Jeremiah, but also elsewhere. It also accounts, importantly for our purposes, for the absolute priority and significance of the marriage relationship and the ideal of it being for life, husband and wife together permanently. The marriage relationship is not one to be entered into lightly or irreverently or thoughtlessly, but one to be entered into carefully, precisely because it is designed in Genesis 2 to be for life. So that then raises the question that we need to deal with next. In what circumstances is it conceivable that the relationship which God designed to be for life should ever be broken by divorce? And this question needs to be approached carefully because, as I said before, we don't want to give the impression that divorce is a good thing in and of itself, that somehow, divorce is mentioned in the Bible and it's an option for people and therefore they can just embrace it without too much thought about it. If marriage is supposed to be permanent, then any thought of divorce is going to be entertained only in the gravest of circumstances. But we need to be clear about what those circumstances would be. So let me try and explore that a little bit now by developing this idea of the covenant as the character of the relationship between a husband and wife. You can think of a covenant as having both a relational aspect, the way in which the two parties engage with each other, the way they fulfill their mutual commitments, and for a husband and wife, those would involve all kinds of things to do with living together, caring for one another, giving themselves to each other sacrificially, physically, in sexual intimacy, and in all kinds of other ways, being committed together to raising children and those sorts of basic commitments which are foundational to marriage. There's those personal, relational aspects. And then there's also the public, so to speak, certificate of marriage, which is the public ratification of that relationship. So think of it as having a personal, relational angle and a public legal document, so to speak, or certificate, which certifies the character of this relationship. Divorce is the undoing of the legal aspect. What divorce does is it says publicly, this marriage is no more. This certificate of marriage no longer applies to this couple. And the only circumstances in which that might legitimately be done, if both parties are still alive, obviously death brings an end to a marriage, the tragedy of one spouse dying brings an end to the relationship, but the only circumstances in which the legal aspect can rightly be brought to an end through divorce is when the relational or personal aspects have been catastrophically broken in some way. And I want to give you an example just to illustrate this and to show you why the provision of divorce, we're not now talking about remarriage, but we're talking about divorce, is actually so important. Imagine a really extreme situation. a situation in which a man and woman were married. They were both Christians when they were married, and they committed to one another, so they've got the relational commitments in place and they begin to live them out, and they've got the marriage certificate which publicly, so to speak, ratifies their union. But now imagine, as is tragically common in our day, the husband becomes physically abusive to his wife, violent towards her, striking her in other ways, making her life intolerable, actually physically endangering her and physically harming her. Well, he has catastrophically reneged on his personal relational commitments to his wife. He's no longer doing the kinds of things that he said that he would do when he married her. He's broken his promises. That relationship is broken. And imagine, again, as is so often the case, this goes on for months, even years, with no apparent sign of remorse or repentance. I'm drawing an extreme case here to illustrate the point, but it's not that extreme actually, given the kind of culture we're living in. This is tragically common. The relationship is over, and in fact the woman, if she remains in this relationship, the longer she remains in it for any period of time at all, never mind months or years even, if she remains in this relationship for any period of time, when the man is behaving like that towards her, she's in physical danger. She needs to be protected. But she needs to be protected from the man who committed himself to care for her, and crucially, who is on this certificate, named on the marriage certificate as the one that she's bound to for life. So what are we to do? The answer is divorce publicly cancels the formal legal commitment when this relationship has already been broken by that man's behaviour. As a consequence of that, what the divorce proceedings do is to protect the wife from the man who is no longer behaving as her sacrificial head and husband, the one who loves her but is actually abusing her physically. It's there to safeguard, in this case, the wife from an abusive spouse. To put the whole thing in different terms, if you think of the legal and relational aspects of this covenant, divorce is the legal seal on the end of a relationship that has already been broken personally. If one party has catastrophically reneged on the personal commitments involved in this relationship, divorce puts a legal stamp on that, saying, this is what's happened. This woman may now leave her husband, in fact ought to leave her husband, and it would be right for her to do so. That's what divorce is. It's the legal statement that the relational aspects of this marriage are over because of the conduct of one of the parties. So just a couple of illustrations to illuminate this. First, divorce can be regarded in that context as a good thing in only this sense. It's a good thing in the sense that the sirens of emergency service vehicles, police cars, fire engines, ambulances, and so on, are a good thing. I hate the sound of those sirens. I'm sure you do too. When an ambulance goes past, you feel, oh, this is terrible. It's not a nice sound because it means that somebody's in trouble. But at the same time, given that somebody's in trouble, somebody's ill, somebody's had an accident, whatever it is, we're all glad that the ambulance is there. Given the previously existing terrible circumstances, this thing which in and of itself is a bad sound actually becomes a good sound. We're all glad when the policeman shows up, when there has been some offence committed, because though we all wish there was no need for police officers, we're glad they're there because they exist to sort out the mess that has already occurred. So it is with divorce. None of us wants divorce to exist. But God has given divorce to protect people because of the sinfulness of the human heart, which in tragically many cases requires that provision in order to safeguard victims of, in that case I gave, violence, but there are other things too. One further comment then on the character of marriage. What this means is that marriage is the kind of relationship which ought not to be regarded as come and go, just take it or leave it, you start it and then you can end it, no problem at all. But neither should it be regarded as the kind of relationship which, to put it in technical terms, is metaphysically indissoluble, you might say. It's not the kind of relationship that actually cannot be ended. But neither is it the kind of relationship that can be ended easily and the ending can be brought in whimsically. It doesn't really matter about the consequences. It's somewhere in the middle. A friend of mine has likened the three pictures to park a car, build a house, bake a cake. Marriage is not like parking a car, where just go in, come out, go in, come out, no consequences particularly. It's a perfectly reversible process. But neither is divorce like baking a cake. When you bake a cake, you mix the ingredients together, and they are so changed in the mixing that they become something different, which simply cannot be separated. You cannot any longer separate the eggs from the flour, from the butter, from whatever else you put in your cake. It's actually impossible to separate it. Marriage is more like building a house. Actually, it's quite a good illustration for all kinds of other reasons. When you build a house, you build something that you want to stand forever. And only in tragic circumstances would you ever want to take it apart and pull it to pieces. But it is technically possible to do it. Having built a house, you could take it apart brick by brick and beam by beam. It wouldn't be metaphysically impossible to do so. It's just the sort of thing you'd only do in those desperate circumstances when something bad had happened and it needed to be taken apart for some reason. Maybe that's an illustration that helps a little bit. But the underlying point is that because, as we said in the first video, marriage is a commitment which ought to be honoured because it's designed for life. Therefore, as I wanted to say in this second video, the circumstances in which it ought to be ended are when one of the parties has catastrophically broken their commitments to the relational aspect of that covenant, and therefore divorce, so to speak, puts an end to the public legal ratification of the marriage covenant. Now, of course, that raises further questions. Firstly, about divorce itself. What circumstances would warrant the issuance of a divorce in biblical terms? I've talked about physical violence, but are there any others? And then, of course, it leaves open the further question, what would happen next? May the person involved in the divorce, either party, in fact, may they remarry subsequently, and under what circumstances? What would we want to see put in place before that happened if we said yes? And I've already indicated what my answer to that would be, but we need to explore those questions in a bit more detail, which we'll do in further videos in this series, Lord willing. For now, I think that'll do. Bye for now, and God bless you.